SuperMeat produces meat directly from cells using fermentation, using very standard fermentation processes. We are relying on large industrial fermentation procedures, the same as used for the current food production like yeast, Renner cheese, beer, and so on. And that means that we're not using scaffolds or carriers in the process. And the great advantage of that, besides the industrial part, which means that we can repurpose existing facilities, that we can leverage all the incredible industrial knowledge that's out there, is the fact that we're getting that, well, the output is 100% meat, 100% animal protein without any kind of foreign material integrated within that. What is important for us as a B2B player is that the food company receives the same thing it's used to getting from the current traditional industry, and that's just the meat. And in addition to that, because we're using early development stem cells, that provides us the ability to produce any type of tissue. So
they can differentiate into muscle or fat or different substances. Yeah.
Yeah, what we're most excited about is now that we've established our foundation. So we have a production process, we have obviously the platform, the cell line, and we have the feed. That's all something that we've established and are now commercializing. Now we can start really having fun and start ripping the fruits of essentially any kind of tissue that we want to produce. So just to give you a grasp of what that means, in the process of cultivated meat production, the first, what we call stage 0, is establishing the cell bank. Mm-hmm. So you do that once. Because we're using stem cells, which are inherently immortal, you don't need to go back and replenish that cell bank. So how does that work, essentially? So once you start from the seed, from the cell bank, and you take cells, put them in the main fermentation facility, that is the mass producer. That produces the mass that you're aiming to deliver, to supply. And then that's 90% of the process. Now you've got a lot of mass. Now, one of the greatest advantages of this kind of system, which is exponential in nature, and the cycle time is less than 24 hours. So what that means is that each day you can harvest half of that to a sequential fermentation facility that actually directs it to muscle or fat or whatever you're aiming to produce, liver, thigh, whatever. And essentially the next day, when you come back to the main fermentation facility, you have a full capacity again to draw from. So essentially every day you can produce a new batch of your full capacity of meat that you're aiming to deliver, and that creates a very high yield, efficient system. And when you're looking at the pharmaceutical industry, that's the kind of their holy grail, a continuous production system that allows you to leverage the potential of an exponential system. And that's never been possible before for the food system, let alone the meat production system. And I think that's the great kind of promise that this industry will bring to the table.
So once you've transferred the cells that have grown and proliferated this biomass into the next stage, how do you get those cells to differentiate into all these other types of cells if you're not having some kind of scaffolding that they can adhere to?
What actually happens is that the cells excrete their own scaffolding.
Okay.
So what we see is they excrete the collagen and the other ECM-related molecules that support them because they need that support.
Yes.
And that's a core part of our technology that allows us to create something that we see as much more a similar process to what happens in the animal's body. And an interesting demonstration of that is the nutritional profile that we shared, which shows the equivalence almost to conventionally produced meat. I say almost because there's always variability in specimen and so on. So, but to the extent that it could be similar, it is. And we attribute a lot of that to the actual very simple and natural process that we have, which is very similar to what happens in the animal's body.
When it comes to the regulatory process, are regulators that you're in conversations with, are they just looking at is it safe or not, or are they looking at is it the same as conventional meat? What are the questions that they're asking?
Yeah, I think it's an incredible question, because that's essentially going back to your previous question, saying, okay, there are 120 companies. Where are you? What are you doing different? So there are 120 companies, but out of these 120, I would say less than 10 are at a point where they have established platform, and not only that, they've got a production process, but they've already demonstrated that it works in a scalable manner. And after that, they've demonstrated on some sort of pilot scale. And the reason this is interesting, because that actually says what I'm doing is not a science experiment anymore, but it's an industrial process.
You have a consistent product you can show to the regulator and reproduce the same product.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can also show the trajectory to cost parity, to large-scale production and yields and all that. And before you have that, you may have an interesting concept, an interesting technological that has a lot of potential, but you still don't know. There's a high level of unknown. So if you look at that stage, there are about 10, maybe 15 companies globally at that stage. So there's much less kind of variability there. And then there are even less who are starting with poultry and not seafood or something else. And then you go back to, okay, what your technology is. And our technology is about doing that using standard fermentation and doing the maturation and the production at these kind of standard processes, and not using scaffolding. So you would have the target tissues that you're looking for, but you're developing it in a very kind of standard fermentation process.
The big question, I guess, apart from whether can you do it, is can you do it at scale in a commercially viable way, and is there a path to making money out of this technology before all the money runs out that has been pumped into this segment? Can you speak a little bit about some of the challenges around the costs and what you're doing as either a company or an industry to bring costs down to make this something that can work at scale?
Sure. I think at the end of the day, and at this stage, or the companies that have reached this stage, have that burden to demonstrate. And I think this is very important for the entire industry, because the frontline leaders, the one who started this process early on, like ourselves, have reached the stage where I think the last kind of barrier or question is commercial viability. So it's not, there's the product, does it taste good? Okay, so many have shown that. There's the nutritional value, which we've demonstrated, and there was the regulatory part, which we believe has been addressed. So commercial viability essentially says whether this, okay, everything ticks, but will this work on a commercial level? And that's essentially the main reason and motivation for us to work with very standard fermentation process. And not only is it because it makes it a more straightforward process and easier, but because it provides a higher level of confidence. Because what we're doing has been done before. What we're doing has been scaled to very large volumes. So we can actually draw from existing industrial data. So I can say with very high confidence, based on very detailed cost of goods analysis models that we have, that are based on large-scale industrial models that show that we have a trajectory to cost parity. And I'm not talking about beef, I'm talking about chicken. So we know it's possible. And it's a combination. Obviously, it's a very complex equation. And the bottom line is the media, it's the feed, but it's not the story. So if you just look at the media, for example, at this stage, or the scales that the industry is at right now, the main cost driver is the growth factors.
Yes.
That's what everyone's talking about. But that's not actually the main cost driver for the media at the long run. At the long run, it's actually the basal media, which will be the main cost driver, which relates to our partnership with Ajinomoto, which is the largest global amino acid producer.
Yes.
So I think as an industry, we need to look at this in a very broad view, and looking at the commercialization, and the most important kind of part of the commercialization is the large scale production.
And when it comes to the bioreactors themselves, Is there a sweet spot in terms of the size of a bioreactor, you know, at a large commercial scale that would make sense? And is there a law of kind of diminishing returns once you get beyond a certain size? Do we know what the sweet spot is yet?
I can tell you that we don't know. We can predict that there definitely will be a sweet spot at 100,000 liter volume for us, for poultry, for example, which is a more kind of challenging category. For beef and others, it may be lower at about 20,000 liters. But then at 20,000 liters, it would be somewhat premium. And so it's a kind of it's a play, because subsidies can come into play, and the fact that this is slaughter-free, antibiotic-free, contaminant-free, and so on. So it's something that we need to understand. I can say with confidence that we know that 100,000 liters we can reach cost parity with chicken. At 20,000 liters, we believe we can, but there's more unknown there. So we are now, as you can see here, this is the pilot production plant, and this has the capacity essentially to support us in working with our partners, developing different kind of applications and validating them before market launch. And then we're working with different kind of partners in the US that we would co-manufacture it there to do the actual pre-market launch of doing the first kind of run of products in the market, which we expect would be in early 2024. And alongside that, we're intending to build our large-scale industrial plant.
And where would the large-scale industrial plant be?
In the US.
In the US. So you're starting with chicken, which is already a fairly cheap source of protein. Why not start with something super high value like, specialty beef products or bluefin tuna or something?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think besides the obvious that obviously chicken is the most sought out protein everywhere. Everyone eats chicken. Doesn't matter what ethnicity you are, wherever you are in the world, which I think is important just to frame cultivated meat as such. Also, chicken in the US and in Israel is considered the most contaminated animal. 100% of chickens sold both in the US and Israel contain E. coli and other contaminants. And because of that, it receives the most antibiotics. Today, even in this setup, in our pilot production, we are completely antibiotic free. So we're already demonstrating that this can work on an industrial level, and also already the research level is also antibiotic free. But in terms of pricing, so we intend when we reach food service, which is the first category, to be in parity with, competitive with the current products. So there it's less of an issue whether it's beef or not. It's more of a food service kind of category, and that's why it's less of an issue. And once we reach retail, we would not just be doing poultry, but other categories as well, which we are working on right now as well.
Can you talk a bit about the investment environment? So in the US, the plant-based meats category has been under a bit of pressure lately, and a lot of commentators and investors have become a little jittery about it. How has that impacted attitudes towards cultivated meat?
I think generally speaking, it's made people more excited about cultivated meat, because before then we would receive more kind of questions why do we even need this? Because we have such great products in the plant-based kingdom. And I think there are great products in the plant-based, and I think they're a long way to go in what they can do still. This is just the beginning.
Yes.
We're just beginning to see the potential of what we could do with plant-based and with precision fermentation. But I still think that what we will see when cultivated meat becomes available, and when we mature as an industry, that actually the kind of combination of these two worlds can achieve incredible things.
What about the kind of attributes that you think are most interesting to consumers?
I think like Bruce Friedrich always says, the first three things that you need to make sure that you have is taste, convenience, and cost.
Yes.
So that obviously, that's kind of your Maslow scale that you need to make sure that you hit. And then if you have all that, then they're interested of, I think there's much more awareness from consumers to better understand how and what came about until their food came to the table. And that's what I think this industry, food industry in general, and specifically cultivated meat and all the new industries that kind of enter the field, have the burden to have much higher kind of quality standards. And I think that's what we're building here, whether it's transparency, traceability, and nutrition, that we can provide very high quality products that were never seen before in the food industry, and hopefully help raise the standard, and people will say, okay, this is a whole new level of quality that we can get from our food. We can already see, especially if you're using these kind of well-tracked kind of processes that people have been using for decades, then you know that it's going to be significantly more efficient. You know the kind of resources that you could utilize. You know the conversion that you would have. So you have all these data points that you could draw from. It's going to be significantly, drastically more sustainable. We haven't quantified it yet, and that's part of the work that we're doing in this setting and with some of our partners to quantify. And I think whatever we quantify at the first stage, there's going to be much more that we'll be able to achieve, because there's so many supporting industries that you can leverage, whether it's side streams, localization of the supply chain, recycling, upcycling, so many things, alternative solutions for energy, that once you have a fully industrialized system, then all this essentially ocean of possibilities open up, and you can start incorporating them inside your process. So our team is a little over 40 now, and we're growing, rapidly growing, mainly focusing on three areas: the commercialization of our poultry, which is on track, as I mentioned, to roll out in 2024, and then expanding to other meat categories, and also working with many partners to develop the products that we aim to launch. So it's extremely exciting, because we've been working towards this moment where we can actually start seeing what this can bring to the table.